Don't rescue me.
Hold on.
A loner cowboy saved a dying native girl not knowing she taught him how to love again. In 1884, in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, a bitter winter had fallen. It was the kind of cold that didn't just nip at your fingertips, but hollowed out your bones from the inside. Cole Jensen, a man shaped by the land and its silence, rode his horse across a ridge, his breath puffing out in white clouds. His hair was streaked with salt and pepper, and the deep lines on his face were a map of a life filled with journeys to nowhere. He rode slowly, not from weariness, but from a caution that had seeped into his blood. He was a man of silence, one who didn't need to say much to exist. He had lived with his past for so long that it had become part of the very air he breathed. Suddenly, a small ripple disturbed the icy surface of a small creek. A hand, pale as bone, was trembling, slowly sinking beneath the thin ice. It was a hand that didn't belong to the cold and silence of this place. It was a life, struggling in despair. Cole had a choice: to keep riding and let the cold claim that life, or to save it and accept a risk that could cost him his own. He didn't think much. He acted on an instinct he had buried long ago. He dismounted, knelt down, and slammed his hand against the ice. The cracking sound echoed through the valley like a bell, signaling that something had been awakened. He grabbed the wrist, the warmth from his hand, a stark contrast to the bone-chilling cold of the ice. He pulled hard. Little by little, he pulled a woman from the water. Her body was limp, without an ounce of resistance. She wasn't dressed for this cold. Her shoulder was bruised, her cheeks pale. Hello, everyone. If you love Wild West love stories or emotional adventure stories from the Wild West Love channel, please comment with a 1 and let me know where you are. I'd be so happy to know. He gently laid her on the snow, his eyes scanning the bruises on her shoulder. He saw a faded tattoo, just clear enough to read a single word: property. A word that should never be tattooed on a human body. When he brought her back to his cabin, Cole did everything he could. He removed her soaking wet clothes, used dry towels to wipe down her cold skin, and then covered her with warm fleece blankets. He didn't touch her much, just enough to save her. He was a warrior, but now he was just a man saving a life. He threw more wood on the fire, making the potbelly stove blaze, filling the room with warmth. He sat there, his boots steaming, a worn Bible open on his lap. He read a passage, his voice hoarse from disuse, just loud enough for him to hear. He read about redemption, about forgiveness, and about love. He read it as a prayer, but also as a confession. His eyes never left the woman on the bed, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the bruises, at the tattoo, at her silence, as if looking into a mirror reflecting his own past. A distant horse gallop was heard. Then the wind suddenly stopped howling. The abrupt silence put him on alert. After hours of lying motionless, Ellara woke up like a drowning woman dragged back from the riverbed. Her eyes snapped open, filled with panic. She saw Cole, a stranger sitting in the corner of the room. The dim light from the stove cast long shadows on the woman's face, highlighting the bruises. She didn't need an explanation. The scars on her wrist, the sharp pain in her ribs, and the memory of the brutal breath of the bounty hunters were more than enough. Her hand reached out, her thin, trembling fingers grabbing the handle of a small dagger on the table. The blade against her throat was colder than the snow outside. It was a choice she knew too well: death or capture. "Don't come any closer." Her voice was hoarse, as if it had been torn apart long ago. "I'd rather die." Cole didn't move. He understood that those words weren't meant for him. It was a vow to herself, a final act of defiance against the world that had trampled her. He slowly stood up, his hands hanging loosely by his sides. He turned his back, walked to the door, and opened it. A rush of cold air poured into the cabin, carrying the wind's mournful cry. Cole stepped outside, leaving the door wide open. Inside, Ellara remained, the dagger still at her throat, but he was no longer there for her to fight against. He had given her a choice. She could run, she could end it, or she could stay. The dagger fell to the floor, a dry clang echoing, sounding more tired than defiant. She stood up, her bare feet touching the rough wooden floorboards. She walked past the simple objects, a chair, a stove, a wool blanket. Each one was a denial of her fear. No shackles, no locks, no imprisonment. Outside, the snow fell like a million tiny needles, stinging her skin, but she no longer felt the cold. The physical sensation was a phantom limb compared to the profound, aching coldness that had settled in her soul. She stood in the open doorway, a fragile boundary between the blizzard and the simmering heat of the cabin, and looked out into the vast emptiness. Her world had always been a landscape of running, a blur of harsh terrain and shadowy figures chasing her. The cold was a constant companion, the sting of wind on her cheeks a familiar terror. But now, in this moment of stillness, the cold was merely weather. The real landscape she was navigating was inside herself. And there he was, Cole, a man who seemed as much a part of the landscape as the jagged rock and stoic pines. He leaned against an old fence post, his hat pulled low, his breath puffing into the air like a silent sigh. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, as if he were waiting for something that might never come. He wasn't in a hurry. He just stood there, like a solitary tree, rooted and unmoving. In a life of constant motion, his stillness was the most foreign thing she had ever encountered. In that quiet moment, something clicked into place inside her shattered mind. The road ahead, the one she had always assumed she would take, was a wild and risky land. She had known that for as long as she could remember, but it was also a road to freedom. For the first time, however, she began to question what that freedom truly meant. For her, freedom had always been defined by a lack of something, a lack of chains, a lack of torment, a lack of ownership. It was the negative space around her pain. Now, she was faced with the terrifying possibility that freedom might also mean the crushing weight of utter solitude. She had had a chance to run. The open door was an invitation, a promise that the endless, lonely road was still hers to travel. But looking at him standing there, silent and steady, a thought as sharp and clear as the mountain air cut through her fear. What she feared wasn't being captured and returned to her old life. She had faced that terror 1,000 times. The new, deeper fear was something else entirely, having to continue on her own, forever bound to a past she couldn't outrun. The solitude she had embraced as a shield had become a prison. She didn't run, and she didn't die. She just stayed. The dagger had fallen from her hand earlier, a decision made out of desperation. This was a different kind of choice. This was a choice made from a place of nascent, fragile hope. That was the moment she began to trust. Not in him, not yet, but in the possibility of something more than just survival. She began to trust that there might be a reason to live beyond simply not dying. Slowly, her bare feet, numb from the cold, turned from the open doorway. She walked back into the cabin, each step a deliberate, conscious act. The warmth of the fire, the simple, clean scent of burning pine, filled her lungs. She looked around the small space, the worn table, the neatly stacked firewood, the bed with the thick, clean blankets. There were no chains, no locks, no barred windows. It was a home. It was a home that had taken her in, that had offered her warmth, that had given her the gift of silence. She sank onto the wooden floor by the fire, huddling close to the heat. The light from the flames danced and flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. In those shadows, she saw the ghosts of her past, the men who had owned her, the faces of those who had sold her, the brutal mark on her wrist that was a constant, searing reminder of her dehumanization. But in the firelight, she also saw a new reality. She saw the kindness in Cole's quiet actions, the offer of a blanket, the unlatched door, the wordless understanding. The silence that had once been a heavy, suffocating blanket became a space for her to breathe. The emptiness she had felt was not an absence of meaning, but an opportunity to fill it with something of her own choosing. She had been a vessel for others' brutality. Now, she could choose to be a vessel for her own life. It was the first moment of genuine peace she had ever known, a stillness that was both a terrifying void and a blank canvas. She sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the crackle of the fire, her mind finally, for the first time in her life, not racing toward escape. Her gaze kept returning to the open doorway, not with the desire to run, but with a strange, burgeoning curiosity. What would she do now that she had a choice? And what would it mean to finally, truly be free? The answer was not clear, but for now, she was content to just sit and listen to the fire, trusting in the quiet promise of a new day. That night, she lay on the simple bed, wrapped in the blankets that she had nearly died without. The wind outside sounded like an endless lament, while the crackle of the wood in the stove was the only rhythm of life. Her fingers traced her wrist, where the tattoo was faded, blurred by water and time, but still there. It wasn't just a tattoo, but a brutal statement. It wasn't a part of her, but a lie that someone had tried to make true. She closed her eyes, not to sleep. She drifted into a hazy recollection. Nameless faces, voices like daggers, cutting into her skin. A stuffy room, a nauseating smell of blood and tobacco, men laughing, hands grabbing, her head being shaved, the clippers louder than her own heartbeat. A collar tightened around her neck, made of leather, metal, and the rust of pain. She flinched, even in her memory, her jaw clenched, her body still fighting. In the cold, apathetic eyes of the bounty hunters, Ellara was just an object, a piece of property that could be bought and sold. Her pain wasn't just the bruises on her skin, but the terrible devastation in her soul. She had lost everything: a home to return to, the parents who had once held her, the siblings she had grown up with. All had vanished, becoming fragments of a shattered memory. Her pain was the pain of a young bird whose wings were broken before it could fly, the pain of a voice that had been silenced. They had turned her into an inanimate object, a commodity that could be traded. Her voice was destroyed. She had no right to resist, no right to choose, not even the right to live. The property tattoo on her wrist wasn't just a mark, but an invisible shackle, imprisoning her in fear and despair. It reminded her that, in this world, she wasn't a person, but merely an object. Her pain wasn't anger or hatred, but a void, a hole in her soul that could not be filled. She no longer knew who she was, where she belonged. Each day was a battle to survive, not to be swallowed by the darkness and hopelessness. It was a dull, unending pain. Outside, the wind continued to moan, like an ancient monster unwilling to leave. Cole sat by the stove, his eyes fixed on the fire, but his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't said more than 10 words since she arrived, but every one of his actions was a message. He left the knife on the table. He left the door unlocked. He didn't shackle her, didn't force her to beg. He had created a void for her, a space for her to choose freedom. When the fire dwindled, he rebuilt it, tossing in another log, then quietly looking over at her. She was curled up in the old wool blanket, in the arms of a burden that wasn't his. At some point in the deep of the night, she got up, barefoot, bare-handed, moving like a ghost. She crossed the room and stood in the open doorway. The snow was up to her ankles, her toes turning red, but she didn't care. She stared into the darkness, her lips pursed. She didn't cry, didn't speak, she just stood there. Cole watched her from the firelight, not a word leaving his lips. He quietly approached, slowly enough for her to hear his footsteps. He draped an old patchwork quilt over her shoulders. It was soft, faded, and frayed at the corners. It was as heavy as a promise, a kindness she had never known. She didn't startle, didn't pull away. She just stood there as it covered her. She stood like that for a long time, seeing nothing, perhaps remembering something long buried, perhaps choosing not to remember. Then she turned and went back inside, lay down again, still not asking his name, or telling him hers. But something had changed. The next morning, she woke up early. Her hands were still red when she brought a bucket of water from the creek. She heated some for tea for herself, but didn't make any for him. When he came in, with his strong arms and the dirt and wood on them, she still gave him the cup. Still no name, still no questions. But there was something different in the silence now. A sharing, an acceptance, something different in the silence. That night, when the fire in the stove blazed up, she no longer shied away. She let the light touch her face, revealing the bruises that were slowly turning the color of sunset. Cole said nothing. He just quietly placed his damp gloves by the stove. As he turned his back, a small hand reached out. Her fingers gently folded the gloves, placing them neatly. It wasn't a ritual, not a thank you. It was just a gesture, a recognition that they were both there. He had seen the bruises, seen the faint fingerprints on her arm, but this time, she didn't flinch. She didn't turn away either. Instead of averting her gaze, she just quietly folded his shirt neatly and put it in the cabinet. That action, neat and deliberate, was like a silent gratitude. The thaw didn't come from the air, but from the silence between them. It was like the melting snow outside the window, dripping little by little, slow and patient. It didn't start with a word, but with a second cup on the table, with a pan being cleaned before the fire died down. Sometimes she would hum a very soft tune, not loud, not melodious, but it was there, like the wind through the pines. Cole noticed, but he didn't say anything. He just continued his work, chopping wood, fetching water, fixing a hinge. And each time he returned to the cabin, something was a little cleaner, a little less broken. Ellara didn't need thanks. She didn't wait for permission either. She just did, like a person trying to rebuild a house that hadn't burned down but had been left to rot. Each day of her newfound freedom was like a corner of that house being touched by the sun, but the house itself was completely empty. That emptiness was not a lack, but a feeling that was strange and profound. It was like leaving a dusty, screaming battlefield and stepping into a clean, silent room. All the noise had stopped, all the danger had vanished, and suddenly the silence became a heavy burden. She had grown used to fighting, to always being on guard. Her life was a relentless flight, a long chain of fear and despair. When all that was gone, a vast emptiness appeared. It wasn't a new pain, but the absence of the old pain. There were no screams, no pounding hooves, no contemptuous eyes. She was free, but she didn't know what to do with that freedom. It was like a tree that had grown used to being whipped by the wind. When the wind stopped, it just stood there, exposed and alone, not knowing how to sprout new growth. Ellara felt like that tree. She had no purpose, no plan. She only had the present. A present so peaceful it was terrifying. That peace came to her slowly and strangely. It wasn't the feeling of happiness or joy she had once dreamed of. It was a profound stillness, a feeling of nothing at all, no fear, no hope. It was like a lake that had been disturbed for too long. Now all the sediment had settled to the bottom. The surface was calm, but the bottom was still filled with the wreckage of the past. She did small things, not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted to fill that void. She mended torn clothes, scrubbed the floor, arranged the simple items in the cabin. Each action was an affirmation that she still existed, that she was still here. She no longer had to run. She could stop. She could breathe. She could live. Every day, she discovered a little more about herself. She realized that her hands could create beautiful things, not just defend herself. She could sew, cook, and even sing. Her voice, once stifled by fear, now hummed softly like a small stream. It wasn't a beautiful voice, but it was a true voice. It was the voice of a soul that had found its way back to itself. That evening, Cole opened an old wooden chest, a smell of blood and gunpowder wafting out. He found an old ledger from his unit, the 11th Cavalry, where he had served. Cole sat in front of the stove, holding the old heavy ledger. It wasn't a book, but a tombstone. It was a mirror reflecting the memories he had tried to bury. He turned the pages, the numbers, the names, the words blurred by time, losses of the Shoshone tribe, women, children, villages razed to the ground. It wasn't war. It was annihilation, a kind of crime that no order would ever permit, but he always knew he was a part of it. He didn't turn away. He looked straight at the truth, turning each page, each one worse than the last, and when he reached the final page, he simply threw the entire ledger into the fire. No prayer, no ritual, just fire and smoke. The ledger was consumed by the flames, the black ink cracking, the edges curling, flaring up once, then dying down. It burned halfway, then stopped. He buried it again. The final page curled slowly, as if a soul was trying to hold on. He watched it disappear, then closed the stove door, without blinking. From outside the cabin, Ellara saw the ashes flying up from the chimney, like the whispers of the past. She said nothing. She just continued to mend the torn curtain with her skillful hands. Her fingers moved, the needle and thread working, as if she was trying to mend a world she no longer believed in. Cole sat across from her, his open Bible on his lap. But he didn't read. His gaze was distant, looking into nothingness. In the cabin, the warmth from the stove drove away the winter cold. But it couldn't warm the emptiness between them. It was a void created by pain and silence, by a past that couldn't be erased. The room was warmer than in previous weeks, but it still felt cold. It was a truth they both recognized, and it made them feel even more alone. He had burned it. The flames in the fireplace flared up, consuming the pages and his painful memories. The flickering firelight shone on his face, his eyes red. He watched the fire burn his past, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. He had once been a warrior, but now he was just a man who wanted to find peace. She did the things a woman who had lost everything would do, quietly mending a torn dress, cleaning the cabin, arranging everything. One morning, Ellara found an old, worn cavalry badge, half buried in the dust. She understood its meaning. It was a symbol of destruction, of oppression. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its contours, feeling its coldness. Cole saw her staring at it. He said nothing. She didn't ask either. Instead of confronting Cole, she quietly went to the creek, took some clay from the stream bed, and molded an identical badge. She meticulously carved it with the same lines, the same grooves. She held it up in front of her, then crushed it in her hand, letting the crumbled clay fall. She shook the remaining dirt from her hands into the air. The two remained silent, as if they were both pinned under heavy stones, and neither knew who would lift the weight first. Before going to bed, Cole placed an old faded wool dress with the name Mary embroidered on the sleeve at the foot of Elara's bed. She took it, her eyes welling up. She understood who Mary was, and that act was a gesture of sharing, of empathy, of acceptance. She touched the name, giving a gentle nod. It was their first sincere exchange, not with words, but with meaningful actions. Later, Cole sat outside, the wind whipping at his coat. He watched her through the window, the firelight flickering behind her, her hair long and loose. She remained there, holding the warm dress, staring into the flames. And that was when he understood. Sometimes, we don't have to do anything. We just need a quiet moment in our lives. For her and for him, nothing could be explained to each other, only silence. In the wooden cabin, where the silence was heavier than any words, Ellara picked up the coin again. It was a small piece of metal, but it held two opposing worlds. On one side, it was engraved with the image of the 11th Division, the unit that had once sown terror upon her people. Looking at it, she saw the sooty faces of her loved ones, the flames licking at the roofs of their homes, the scar on her wrist serving as an indelible reminder of her loss. Every fiber in her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from a persistent, lingering pain. She had lost everything, and men like Cole had taken it from her. Yet, this coin was also a different kind of reminder. It was proof of Cole's existence, the man who had saved her from the icy water. Holding it in her palm, she remembered his calloused hand pulling her up, the warmth of his jacket embracing her dying body. Without him, she would have been lost forever in the freezing creek. Gratitude, a foreign and complex feeling, surged in her chest, clashing with the hatred that had become ingrained in her flesh and blood. How could she forgive him when every time she looked at him, she saw the shadow of an enemy, but also the benefactor who had given her a second life? She closed her eyes, once again putting herself in Cole's position. She saw herself as a veteran, living with the ghosts of the past. She saw the guilt, the loneliness, and the burden of sins that could not be washed away. Perhaps he hadn't had a choice, just as she hadn't had the right to live freely. They, like two pawns on a chessboard of fate, had been pushed into positions no one wanted. He was forced to obey orders, and she had to endure. Now, the game had changed, but they were still trapped in it. He chose to stay, not because he wanted forgiveness, but because he wanted to do the right thing. On one side was an Ellara still aching with the pain of her family, friends, loved ones, and her life being trampled. On the other side was an Ellara grateful for her rescuer and seeing his own torment. She heard the frantic screams for revenge, but she also heard her heart's need for love, for a full, happy, and meaningful life. Opening her eyes, Ellara looked at the coin, no longer seeing simple hatred or gratitude. She saw a choice. She would not keep it, would not let it become a heavy burden in her heart. She had made a decision. Ellara looked out the window, where Cole was standing under the iron-colored sunset. His rugged silhouette was cast against the wooden wall, and he was contemplative, silent every day. Time and the brutality of war had stripped him of his self-confidence and peace, little by little. Soldiers like him would have to live with their burden forever, for the rest of their lives. He didn't know that she had seen him, didn't know that she was stepping into his world. She smiled, a smile without bitterness. She understood that the silence between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge connecting two worlds, two people, two destinies. And then she got up, walked to the stove, and added another log to the fire. The warmth of the fire gently caressed her heart, little by little. That same night, Cole looked out the window and saw fresh horse tracks in the snow. Not his horse, not theirs. A sudden fear came over him, shattering the peace they had worked so hard to find. This place was no longer safe. People would come, and they wouldn't bring peace. The cold wind whistled through the door cracks, carrying the scent of danger and bad news. The peace in the cabin was just a thin veneer. Cole realized this when he found an old canvas bag on the porch. Inside, a photo of Ellara and a wanted poster with the words "Runaway Property." Cole's eyes lingered on the photo, then shifted to Ellara. She recognized the photo, her eyes vacant. Elara's voice was a faint whisper. "I didn't kill him, but I wished I could have." She told him about the man who had bought her, about the forced marriage, about being treated like an object. Her words no longer held fear, only a pain that had been tightly suppressed for so long. Cole didn't look at her. He just knelt by the stove, listening. His action was one of respect, of acceptance. He let her speak everything she had buried inside, so she could be free. And when she finished, he simply added another log to the fire, a small but meaningful act, a promise that he would protect her. Outside the town of Timber Ridge, the sound of hooves echoed. Ma Jessie, the saloon owner, was standing at the bar, her sharp eyes watching everything. Suddenly, a strange man walked in, a rifle on his shoulder. He was Buck Scars O'Malley, a ruthless bounty hunter. He placed a wanted poster on the bar, ordering a drink. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A Shoshone woman." Ma Jessie quietly wiped a glass, her eyes still on him. She said nothing, but her look conveyed a message. At the same time, Eli, the young deputy, was standing in a corner of the saloon. He overheard the conversation and saw the wanted poster. A seed of doubt sprouted in his heart. He had heard his father, Sheriff Holt, talk about similar cases, but he had never felt them to be so unjust. At that moment, Cole was also in town. He bought some supplies and secretly passed a letter to Ma Jessie. In the letter, he told her to be careful and gave her some instructions. Ma Jessie read the letter and scoffed. She understood that a storm was coming, and no one could stop it. When he returned to the cabin, Cole found a strange boot print in the snow. Not his boot, not Elara's. Someone had been following them. Someone knew where they were. He and Ellara looked at each other, and without a word, they understood. Safety was gone. It was time to face them. Sheriff Holt and Eli rode up to the cabin. They stopped, standing tall in their saddles. "Cole Jensen," Sheriff Holt said, his voice hard and cold. "You're hiding a fugitive." Cole didn't answer. He just looked into Sheriff Holt's eyes, his gaze filled with resolve. He couldn't defeat them with guns. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful action is to accept. He stepped aside, letting them arrest him and tie up Ellara. As they rode away, Cole and Ellara were silent. Sheriff Holt believed he had won, but Eli, the young deputy, kept glancing at Ellara. He saw the strength and pain in her eyes, and he understood that something wasn't right. An internal battle was raging within him, between his loyalty to his father and his own conscience. The wind whistled through the rocks, carrying the whispers of a story that had ended, but another was just beginning. Sheriff Holt sat by a dying fire, watching the faint flames lick at his wrinkled face. His gun, the symbol of his power and law, lay abandoned in the snow, left behind by his own son. Eli had left with Cole and Ellara, without a goodbye. Eli's choice wasn't just a betrayal, but an indictment of the system Sheriff Holt had dedicated his life to protecting. He couldn't say anything. He had already said too much. Cole, Ellara, and Eli rode in silence. Each hoofbeat was a heartbeat, carrying them further from the past and closer to an uncertain future. Eli, the young deputy, looked at Ellara. He no longer saw a frightened woman, but a resilient one, full of inner strength. He had witnessed injustice, cruelty, and sacrifice. He understood that there are laws etched deeper than on paper, and the law of the heart is true justice. They arrived at a hill. Eli pointed to a small valley where thin wisps of smoke rose from teepees, hidden among the trees. It was Elara's home. Eli spoke a single sentence. "Your path ends here. Good luck." Then he turned his horse around, heading back to the town where he would likely never feel like he belonged again. Ellara dismounted and walked alone into the village. The women and children watched in silence. Ellara didn't cry or complain. She simply walked. An elderly woman stepped out, saying nothing, just touching Elara's cheek, then touching the faint scar on her wrist. Ellara took out a burnt piece of metal, a part of the collar that had once shackled her, and placed it in the woman's hand. The woman nodded, gently placing it in the fire. Love and forgiveness were shown through wordless actions, for those moments are what truly matter in Wild West love stories. That night, Cole stayed outside the village, sitting alone on a rock. He didn't seem to want to go in. A small boy approached him, placing a piece of metal in his hand. It was an old 11th Cavalry badge, melted down and reshaped into a flying bird. Its wings were raised high, touching each other, symbolizing forgiveness and freedom. Cole looked at it, his fingers trembling as he touched each line. This was not a badge of war or destruction. It was a mark of rebirth. Cole was there all night, gazing at the flying bird in his hand. He didn't cry, but he felt a weight had been lifted, leaving a sense of peace in his heart. He stared at the new badge, the image of a free bird, and felt something shatter in his chest. It wasn't sadness, but a deep sense of liberation. He had carried the weight of war, of the screams, of the blood and tears. He had once believed that war was necessary, that it was glory. But now, he knew that war was only destruction. It had stolen his youth, his love, and the peace in his soul. He remembered the early days, when he was a young man, full of passion and ideals. He had eagerly gone to the battlefield, believing he was fighting for a noble cause. He had journeyed through snowy valleys, crossed freezing rivers, and fought in bloody battles. He had seen his friends fall, seen the panicked faces of children. He had seen that there were no heroes in war, only victims. He had seen that there was no glory in war, only brutality. He had become a man of silence, one who no longer believed in any ideals. He had become a man of solitude, one who could no longer love. He had become a man of destruction, one who carried the burden of unforgivable sins. The badge in his hand was a reminder. It was not a badge of war, but a mark of rebirth. It was not a badge of destruction, but a mark of forgiveness. It was not a badge of loss, but a mark of hope. It showed him that even in the brutal world of war, there could still be love and forgiveness. It was a story about love, a cowboy love story where wounds are healed. Their story, one of the best Western stories, is a testament to the fact that love can blossom even in the harshest places. Please subscribe to follow the latest stories. In the best Wild West stories, we often see heroes saving the world. But here, we see a man saving his own soul. He slept under the stars, and when he woke up, he no longer felt the coldness he had before. A year passed, and the Montana sky was no longer covered by the biting cold. The town of Timber Ridge was no longer a town full of bounty hunters and harsh laws. The wounds were still there, but they had faded, leaving behind valuable lessons. Under the brilliant golden sunlight of spring, on the land that had once been torn up, a small farm had grown. It was Cole Jensen's farm, which he had rebuilt from the rubble, not in haste, but with the meticulousness of a man rebuilding his life. Ellara was no longer the shy girl of old. She wore a blue dress, mended at the wrist, which Cole himself had once given her. She was tending a small garden where she grew wild flowers. The garden bloomed, full of color, a symbol of the new life she had found. Cole, who had only ever known loneliness, now always had a woman by his side. They didn't say much, but every touch, every look, was enough to say it all. Their relationship was built on silence and trust, not on flowery words. One afternoon, Eli rode up. He had become a deputy in another town, but he always visited Cole and Ellara's farm. He and his father, Sheriff Holt, had mended their relationship, but it could never go back to what it was. Eli had learned that justice is not always found on paper, but in the heart. He watched Ellara watering the plants, seeing the happiness in her eyes. He understood that by standing up for her, he had found true justice. Their story, one of the best Western love story, is a testament to how compassion can change a person's fate. When night fell, Cole and Ellara sat on the porch. Cole took out the flying bird badge. It had been polished, and it glistened under the moonlight. Ellara touched it, then placed it in Cole's palm. "You were once a warrior," she said softly. "Now, you are a protector." Cole squeezed her hand, knowing that what she said was true. In the best cowboy love stories, love is not just possession, but liberation.